3 weeks later, the RLI, the Selous Scouts, Rhodesian Artillery and the Armoured Car Regiment combined in Operation Miracle to take out the new Zanla camp north of Chimoio, housing several thousand guerrillas in well-fortified complexes. The keys to the camp were Hills 761 and 744, with their commanding fields of fire. The crux to the battle was an ominous, steep-sided rock feature, dubbed Monte Cassino, with about 100 Zanla regulars in attendance. The Air Force hunters took care of Hills 761 and 744, but no amount of aerial bombardment could dislodge the defenders of Monte Cassino. Following behind an artillery barrage, the Scouts and RLI troopers assaulted the summit. The Zanla guerrillas had died to a man, defending their positions, with the summit a desolate wasteland of body parts and shattered trees.
Grab it and go.
During the initial air and ground attack against the Zanla main defense system, Security Force ground troops advanced into the camp complex. Rex Nyonga, Zanla's Deputy Chief of Defense, was in the camp during the initial airstrike. He ordered his vehicle to make good his escape, but the driver panicked and crashed into a tree.
Now let's 7-1 Alpha, just move up to our right and have a look at something quickly. Okay, 7-1 Alpha, go and have a look.
Roger, what are you firing at? You're in a tree. Roger, carry on. Go forward, John.
Suddenly, we were there, at the camp, then too far in, right over them now, flying through dark orange smoke. The smell of burning wood and explosive filled the chopper. We twist hard left as the pilot searches desperately for a place to put us down. I'm looking up at the sky from my seat, totally helpless. The guys on the other side of the chopper are shoving backwards to keep from falling out. Below, it's nothing but trees, tightly packed with no room for this big chopper to land. We wish we were back in the Alouettes. Lance Corporal Barry Gribben, Support Commando.
Not having faced tanks before, our guys was understandably very nervous, and we said to them, listen, you're okay, because you got mines in front of your position, and we will help you. We then had a battery of guns in support, and a troop of Panhard 90s, and we sent the Panhard 90s down from Monte Cassino. We sent them down to the 3 Commander in the stop position to take on the tanks, which they would do very adequately. The 90mm gun is renowned for its armor-piercing capability. And the guns we let loose onto the tanks. Now, this is probably never ever heard of in modern-day warfare. The 25-pounder, an ancient gun, would take on modern-day tanks. Well, they fired the guns, and we believe we hit one because it was seen to go off with smoke billowing out of it. At that, the Mozambique army turned tail and ran with their tanks and everything, so the threat of armor dissipated into nothing. The following day, we managed to capture the position, which is largely vacated. But interesting enough, there was a baboon tied to a tree, and this is what they used. The baboon gave early warning of Air Force raids. It was able to pick up the noise of aircraft.
Food and clothing originating from various Western and Eastern countries sympathetic to the terrorist cause were found, including medical supplies from UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and powdered milk as a gift from the Christian Peace Movement in Switzerland. Boxes containing new North Korean AKM assault carbines and British P2 anti-tank mines manufactured in January 1977 were also located. Terrorist camps of this size are now protected by recently acquired Russian anti-aircraft weapons such as this 3-barreled 20mm. 12,7 and 14,5 heavy machine guns were also encountered. Large quantities of arms, ammunition and equipment were either recovered or destroyed by security forces.
Well, it's my great privilege to have Trooper Dave Hughes with us from the Rhodesian Armoured Car Regiment. What was it called? The Corps of Armoured Cars or Armoured Car Regiment? It was the Armoured Car Regiment, eh?
No, it was when I transferred into it. It was the Rhodesian Armored Car Regiment.
Okay.
By the time I left, it was the Rhodesian Armored Corps.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I'm very impressed. Dave's uniform still fits him perfectly, and he's got his beret, which looks really jacked. And yeah, can't wait to hear your story, Dave. Let us know sort of a bit of your background and how you ended up in the armored cars.
I should start from the beginning, how I found out about the conflict that was ongoing in Rhodesia. And that occurred in November 1976. I was a young police officer serving on York Regional Police Force, and I had been sent to the Ontario Police College at Aylmer, Ontario, which is where every policeman in Ontario goes when they're newly hired. And at the time, it was A part and B part. They were both 6 weeks in total, and I underwent those training classes in November in 1976. In November of 1976, our class came into, I believe it was criminal law and procedure class, and it was taught by a Windsor police officer by the name of Sergeant Carl Moffat, who was a legend in Windsor policing circles. He was about 6'6", 265 pounds, wore cowboy boots, not an ounce of fat on him whatsoever, and many a story has been told about Carl Moffat's escapades on the Windsor police force. He was a brute of a man, but he was a smart man too. By no means was he a slow fellow. He was sharp. Anyhow, we filed into class November 76. He's sitting at his desk. He's got his feet up on the table with his cowboy boots prominently displayed, reading the Windsor Star newspaper, and there's a front page headline about a young Canadian who had just been killed in action serving in the Rhodesian Light Infantry by the name of Matthew Charles Lamb.
Yeah, Matt Lamb was a good friend of mine.
Yes. So you're probably aware of the background story.
I am, yeah.
Moffat was reading this article with this disgusted look on his face, and I remember he slammed the paper down on the table, and he said, "What's the matter with these Rhodesians? Don't they know who they're hiring?" And then he proceeded to tell us about Matt's very sad and tragic tale in 1966, where he had shot 4 people in Windsor, Ontario, killing 2 of them, and had been sent to the Oak Ridge facility in Penetanguishene after being found not guilty by reason of insanity. It just so happened that in my class, there was an ex-British South Africa policeman by the name of Ken Greenwood. And Ken spoke up and said, well, that country, Rhodesia, is under sanctions. They can't just pick up a phone and call somebody in Canada and say, hey, what about this guy, Matt Lamb? Is he okay? Not possible. So they had to rely on whatever bona fides Matt had presented them with. And that was my introduction to the conflict in Rhodesia.
Gosh, yeah, it's a small world. Matt was in intake 140 and was with me in RLI training troop. And we had both signed on to join the Special Air Service Regiment. And but before we were allowed to go on selection, we had to first do an 18-week RLI recruit course because the SAS didn't want to kind of teach us the basics of how to strip an FN or, they didn't want us to do boot camp. When we did our SAS training, it was more advanced stuff like demolitions and signals and medics and that type of thing. So Matt, I got to know Matt quite well. I mean, we went through recruit course together. We both ended up in 3 Commando RLI together. We did that SAS selection together. I passed, but Matt didn't pass that time around. Apparently, he passed later. And Matt he was a nice guy. He was popular amongst the soldiers, and we were all devastated when he was killed. I believe he was killed in action, but I'm told that he was mistakenly shot by his own MAG gunner when he crossed in front of the guy. But it was only after his death that we all found out about Matt's background. A lot of guys refused to believe it, but having done the research, unfortunately, it's true. Everything you've just said. But still, we were good friends, and I didn't detect anything weird about him.
John, I have never heard a bad word spoken about him by anybody that served with him.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe he had a troubled youth. I heard a rumor, I'm not sure if it's true, that he went on to become before he came to Rhodesia, he went on to become a firefighter, those guys who parachute into the fires. But I don't know if I've never managed to confirm that. Yeah.
So I wrote an article that was published in 2001 in the Rhodesian SAS Association Journal Wing Chatter.
Right.
And to gather the information for that article, I went to see Justice Saul Nosenchuk, who was the Chief Justice in the court system in Windsor, Ontario at the time, and who had been Matt's pro bono counsel during the time when he was charged with capital murder. And Saul provided me with a wealth of information about the background, the family history, and his subsequent treatment at the Oak Ridge facility, which resulted in 1972 in Matt being released by the Ontario Review Board Council, which was almost unheard of. Most people who were sent to the Oak Ridge facility on indefinite warrants never came out of there again. Matt was one of the very, very few who underwent successful rehabilitative treatment and was able to convince the Ontario Review Board that he should be re-released or released into the society again. part of the stipulation was he had to spend 1 year living with Dr. Elliot Barker, who had treated him during his time at Oak Ridge facility. And at the end of that year, he was then free to go and do what he wanted to do. And that would be 1973, I believe. And he went off to try and join the Israeli army during the Yom Kippur War, and was unsuccessful because you have to be Jewish to be in the Israeli army at that time. And somehow in that journey, he heard about the conflict in Rhodesia, and he ended up flying down to, I'm going to say probably Johannesburg, and then popping up into Rhodesia, into Salisbury, where he presented himself for enlistment in the Rhodesian army.
Yeah. Yeah, he was in recruit course in starting July 1974, intake 140. Yeah.
Yeah,
and
the timelines jive with his release and spending a year with Dr. Barker before being able to travel freely. Yeah.
Right.
My understanding from what I've read is that in the year that he was with Dr. Barker and during his treatment, which actually involves some new treatments. They were using psychedelic drugs to treat people with conditions like his. And just to point out, at the time of the shootings, as a young 16-year-old boy, he had experienced a psychotic break from reality, and for a variety of reasons. There were many. There was numerous issues that were ongoing in his personal and family life, and it resulted in this psychotic break from reality, schizoid break from reality, wherein he stole his uncle's shotgun and went out on the streets and committed the crimes that he committed. But interestingly, I'm a member of the Royal Canadian Legion branch in Harrow, Ontario, where I live. And one of our members, who just passed away 2 weeks ago, was one of Matt's schoolmates in high school. And I spoke to him frequently about the time that he spent with Matt in class, and he didn't have a bad word to say about him, even as a youth. So, I don't think Matt was. I don't think there was something in his personality that predestined him to being a mass killer. I don't. I think circumstances and things occurred that caused him to have this break with reality, and he went and did this terrible thing. I mean, there's no question about it. But
yeah. So that's how you became. That's when you first heard about Rhodesia.
This was my introduction to Rhodesia, and I'm a 19-year-old kid in a policeman's uniform, and this ex-BSAP constable had also been a constable in Birmingham, England, before he was recruited by the BSAP in the early 70s to go and join the BSAP. And his room in the college was beside my room. And there were several other ex-British patriots who had come to Canada and joined various police forces. We had an ex-RUC inspector, a fellow who had been a London Metropolitan Police officer, and several others. And they used to gather at Ken's room after class, and they would drink, which was forbidden. But they'd been around the block a bit, and so I'm this 19-year-old kid, and I'm surrounded by these 30, 40-ish-year-old experienced worldly police officers. And they used to tell me that, hey, kid, you're too young to be a policeman. You should go and join the Rhodesian Army or the British South Africa Police Force. So 2 years later, 1978, in December, I was getting tired of watching the streetlights go on and off in a rural area that I was policing and or rounding up stray cattle, and I realized they were correct. So in December of 78, I quit York Regional Police, and by January of 79, I had flown down and signed on in the Rhodesian Army.
Wow. So you didn't join the BSAP after all?
No, I went to both recruiting depots. I went to the Army recruiting depot and I went to Morris Depot, and they both said, we'll take you immediately. But I remember the Army recruiting officer said, go back to your hotel room and enjoy your weekend. It's the last one you're going to have for a while. And my friend Ken, the ex-BSAP officer, had given me booklets, pamphlets, information on what was going on in Rhodesia, and I'd managed to grab a copy of the First Contact book that came out, and I remember reading through the KIA numbers in the back of the book, which I think went up to about 1977, I think, roughly. And I noticed that there was the BSAP were overly represented in the KIA numbers. So I thought, I don't think I'm going to go for the BSAP. And I noticed that the least number of KIA was in the SAS. So I thought, I want to try for the SAS. And so that's what I told the recruiting officer. And at the time, the SAS was taking raw recruits and training them from the get-go on their recruit training course. So I went into the Rhodesian SAS as a recruit at the new Cabrit Barracks up by the airport, and embarked upon their recruit training program from January to March of '79. And the recruit training program didn't start immediately because intake 163 was already underway, and they were almost to the point where they were going to go to the advanced battle camp at Gwai, and there was no way that I'd have been able to catch up with them. I'd been a policeman, I hadn't been a soldier. So I was doing all those routine camp chores and duties until our intake 164 started, which would have been in February of '79. But that was a very interesting period of time because I recall that we would parade for duty in the morning, and you'd get detailed to go to places in the regiment that I would never have imagined. For example, boat troop, and there wasn't much water around the airport that I could see. And so there I am one morning going into the boat troop stores and learning all about the Zodiacs and the Klepper kayaks and all of that sort of thing. And it truly was it was a bit of an eye opener, because it gave you a hint at what they were doing behind the scenes in their operations. And the kayak thing especially, I thought that was fantastic when I saw the Klepper kayaks, and how you could pack them up into backpacks and transport them nearly anywhere you wanted to go. And I was fascinated by that.
On that subject, we did our Clipper canoe and Zodiac courses at Lake McIlwain. And the Clipper canoe has I can't remember exactly how many pieces it is, but it's a whole bunch of pieces with like male and female parts that clip together. And there's kind of like braille,
Yes.
little things raised like braille. You can feel it with your fingers. And we had to memorize every male and female part and where they clip together. And we had to be able to assemble that canoe in the dark with a blindfold on in the rain.
You should be able to do it in about 15 minutes, roughly.
Yeah.
About 15 minutes if yeah.
Yeah, I loved it, but I just remember it was quite a challenge to memorize all the male and female parts and what sequence they had to be clipped together. And then you had to be able to go in with all your kit and your rifle, and then roll it upside down, and then come right again, and not lose your rifle to the bottom of Lake McIlwain.
Yes. On a number of occasions, I found myself in the armory, handing out or taking in operators' weapons as they either sign them out or sign them back in again, and that was fascinating as well. There was some incredible stuff in that armory that they were using at the time. The kind of weaponry that you can just dream about, silenced American 180 22 rimfire machine guns, and silenced AK-47s, all kinds of crazy stuff. Uh, uh, I always remember that the barrels and the actions were supposed to be cleaned when they were turned in, and oftentimes they were not. And I would look down the barrel at the and say, well, it's not clean. And oh, I'm a nobody. I'm a recruit. I've got no rank. I'm nothing. And they were mighty pissed at me when I would say, nope, go clean it. But I was only going by what I was told. The rifle's got to be clean when it comes in. And that was another interesting aspect of it. And it was during that time frame, actually, John, that I met Bob McKenzie. Got detailed to help his squadron when they came in from an operation, unload all of their explosive ordnance into the explosive ordnance stores, which was actually outside of the camp in a very deep, dug down section of the camp, so that if things blew up, it wouldn't flatten the camp. And that's where I first met Bob McKenzie, which was another really interesting part of that whole experience, that 3 month experience. The legend himself. It was, and what a great guy he was. Nothing. He reminded me of a basketball coach, or not screaming, yelling, hollering, just very matter of factly telling you what to do and how to do it and that sort of thing. And that was a very interesting part of that experience as well. Talk to me. Like, I'm a recruit. I didn't even have a rank of trooper yet, and it's speaking to me like, yeah, terrible shame when he was killed in Sierra Leone. Yeah. So around February, our intake 164 recruit course started at the SAS regiment, and one of the things that I noticed, so in that interim period, there was I wish I could remember. I believe his first name was Rob, and he was a basketball player, and I was a basketball player. That had been my thing as a high schooler. Basketball was my game, and he told me that the Rhodesian Army was having tryouts for the Rhodesian Army basketball team to play in a tournament in Bulawayo. So one weekend, when I was able to get time away from my duties at the SAS regiment, I tried out for the Rhodesian Army basketball team, and I made it, and ended up going down to Bulawayo and playing in this tournament, which included teams from all over the place in Rhodesia, and I think there was even a South African team there too, and playing in that tournament as a member of the Rhodesian Army basketball team. We lost, but I think we won. I think we were 50-50 on our win-loss score. But that was another interesting part of being at the Rhodesian SAS regiment at the time. And I remember I drew my FN rifle that I'd been issued with to take with me while we drove down to Bulawayo in this tiny little vehicle that had 4 of us in it. We were all from the SAS regiment, and we had our FNs sticking out of all 4 windows as we drove hellbent for leather from Salisbury down to Bulawayo. And another really, one of those things you don't expect you're going to do when you go and join the Rhodesian Army to fight in a war. So we got stuck into our course, and one of the things that I had noticed was most of Rhodesia is at an altitude of about 5,000 feet. Right. And I've come from basically sea level countryside all my life, and there is a huge difference in how well you can perform athletically at 5,000 feet to how well you can perform at sea level. And that was one of the things that really I struggled with. I had a very difficult time acclimating to that difference in altitude. And I would be like, what the heck is wrong with me? What, I should be able to run like the wind, and I'm young enough and still fit enough. I should be able to be dancing around here like with no problem. But I was sucking wind everywhere, and it was the altitude difference, and also the intensity of the sunlight. In my part of the planet, 6 months of the year we don't get enough sunlight to manufacture vitamin D in our bodies. So um, I was not prepared at all for the intensity of the sun, which caused havoc on my exposed skin. It was unbelievable. Blisters popping up as soon as the sunlight hit me, and wow, I had a tough time with that as well. So probably 6 months or more before I became accustomed to the climatic conditions in Rhodesia and was able to perform, reasonably well physically anyhow. Yeah. So about 4 or 5 weeks into the recruit course, we were doing our afternoon PT, and I came down with heat stroke and passed out. And I was CASEVAC back to the barracks, and I was right, like, I remember coming to briefly at the barracks, and I was burning up with fever. It was unbelievable. And I remember they brought the camp medic in, and he took my temperature, and as soon as he read it, he said, "Get this man to the hospital immediately, Andrew Fleming, immediately." So they CASEVAC me off to Andrew Fleming, and I spent the next couple of weeks there recovering from heat stroke. And then they transferred me to KG6 hospital. And while I was there, I came down with I picked up a gastrointestinal bug that was devastating as well. As soon as I would drink a cup full of water, it would come out my rear end explosively, like within seconds. And it just about killed me, I swear. Went back to the regiment. They said, you can come back on the course, no problem. So we're probably into our 5th or 6th week by this time, and very shortly would be heading off for the advanced battle camp at Kauai. But as soon as I went out onto the field and tried carrying on with the program, I knew there was not a chance I was going to make it. So I went to Warrant Officer John Masson and told him, I said, "Sir, I don't think I'm going to be able to keep up with the program." And they were willing to back squad me to the next course, but they weren't sure when that could be. And already by this time, the winds of war were beginning to change, and there was talk about there's soon going to be an end to the war. So I was like, I didn't fly halfway around the world, quit my job back in Canada to come here and not see any action. So I cast around trying to find out where could I go where I would be quickly thrust into the battle. And I felt I had had enough training as a recruit already at the Rhodesian SAS recruit course that I could be an asset to another unit. And I found out about the Armored Car Regiment and arranged an interview with the commanding officer, Darrell Winkler, who was an American as well, and his regimental sergeant major, Stan Van Breda. And that would be at the beginning of May 1979. And they agreed to take me on. And they put me in support troop infantry for the May-June 79 internal election period. And we were sent to Mudzi for that 2-month period where we did all the support troop infantry things you can imagine support troop infantry doing, which was, again, part of the country that was breathtakingly beautiful. The rock outcrops and that whole area was really, really impressive. And I spent an awful lot of time patrolling around and through it and over it and whatnot. We had a few contacts and encounters with the enemy. We had a couple of we had an incident where RLI fire force out of I think Matoko, I think would have been closest one to Mudzi, I think, where they got involved in a really big contact with a large group of, I think, Zanla forces, and we were involved in that as they used up all of their Fire Force troops, including the cooks and bottle washers, and they came calling us to help as well. So that was a very interesting contact. And I remember at the end of it, the next day, we went and policed up the battlefield, and we found 30, maybe 40 Zanla bodies, and got all their equipment and intelligence information from them. Uh, my understanding is one of them, one of the weapons that was recovered was traced back to the attack on the Salisbury oil refinery that caused so much havoc back in, I think, the year before in '78, I think, or maybe '77. But there'd been a pretty devastating attack on the Salisbury oil refinery. And one of the weapons had been traced back to that. Now, whether the person carrying it was part of that attack or whether the weapon had been passed on to somebody else, I don't know. But yeah, that was it was a pretty interesting scene, that whole contact.
Yeah, sounds like quite a big one. I mean, 40 bodies is a lot.
Oh, very. And so, of course, by the end of it all, the elections happened in May, and the new Muzorewa government was installed in June. And we were back in Salisbury at KG6 Barracks, Blackus and Houston Barracks. And I went from being in support troop infantry to going on the Eland 90 armored car course.
Wow.
Yeah, and we, for basically June and the beginning of July, learned how to drive, shoot, and command the Eland 90 armored car.
Wow.
And yeah, which was, again, another interesting facet of soldiering in the Rhodesian Army. The Eland armored car, for its weight, a 6.5-ton vehicle, had a tremendous amount of firepower for a small vehicle. It really did. And it had a very good range and speed that it could travel over tarred roads and that sort of thing. It had good cross-country capability.
What was its main gun armament? What was the caliber of it?
It had the main gun on the Eland 90 was the 90 millimeter medium velocity French designed cannon, which was capable of taking out either a Soviet T-34 or even a T-54-55. It could take them out, hitting them in the right spot.
So it was similar to the famous German 88 millimeter gun that they had on their Tiger tanks.
A much lower velocity. It was a medium velocity cannon, whereas the 88 was a very high velocity cannon with a much greater range. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, a longer barrel.
But that little 90 mil cannon on the Eland was still pretty potent for a small vehicle. And you had twin Browning 7.62 machine guns, one coaxially mounted with the main gun and the other one on the anti-aircraft mount. And you had 3,000 rounds of belted 7.62 NATO ammo for both of those machine guns, which is quite a bit.
Yeah,
that's a lot of firepower. Yeah, and the other stuff, smoke dischargers, grenades, personal sidearms, all that kind of stuff. So,
were you a driver or a gunner or?
Well, my favorite was being the gunner. That's what I loved, was shooting. So yeah, give me the gunner's position any day. But my first posting on an Eland was as a commander.
Sure.
So I'm in July of '79. I'm a commander of Eland 90, and I believe the place we got sent to on our first trip was Missouri Bonnie, if I remember correctly. I know we went through Sipalilo to get to where we were going, which I think was Missouri Bonnie. And we spent the time there patrolling around in the Elands. But my Eland had a problem. It had a knock in the drive shaft assembly at the U-joint. And it was sounding like the U-joint was going to fail. And we went to the motor mechanic and we told him about it. And he said, keep on driving it. He said, it always makes that noise. Well, we're in a convoy or patrol that we're doing, and the U joint let go, and it started flailing around, and it took out the fuel pump, which in a gasoline powered vehicle, because these were gas powered, they weren't diesel powered, started a pretty fantastic fire in the crew compartment of the Eland. So we pulled over to the road and we bailed out. And my driver, who was a South African kid who had come up and joined the Rhodesian Army, and I cannot remember his name to this day, very bravely went into that inferno and grabbed the fire extinguisher and put out the fire because the vehicle was completely bombed up, and had it burned up, all that ammunition would have cooked off. So I ended up getting charged with a couple of dereliction of duty charges, which had me under close arrest back to Blackiston Houston Barracks to face trial for not doing my duty, which was, as I explained to the officer conducting the trial at the time, I told him, I said, we told the motor mechanics about it, and they said, keep driving it. That always makes that noise. So the charges were stayed. But I never commanded an armored vehicle again. I went back to my favorite position as the gunner. So I was happy with that.
Gosh.
Yeah. So that brings us around to end of July, and we're out again. I'm a gunner this time on an and trying to. Oh yes, we were sent out. Oh my gosh, it was near Mashumbi Pools. No, not Mashumbi Pools. Mana Pools. We were not too far from Mana Pools, but we were in the dry part of Mana Pools. So towards the east, where Rhodesia met with Zambia and Mozambique, that tri-corner border area. And the place we were staying at was it was an abandoned school that had been attacked probably by Zanla, and everybody driven away from the school and the village. And so that's where we were based. And about August, I'm going to say mid-August, we were suddenly sent back to Salisbury again. We were relieved by a new group of armored car trained soldiers who relieved us from our vehicles, and then we were sent on transport back to Salisbury. And it was hush hush, kind of like nobody knew quite what was going on. We knew something was up, and when we found out that we'd been chosen to be the new crew on the T-54-55 tanks that Rhodesia had been given by South Africa after South Africa seized them from a French transport ship called the Astor in June of 1979. And there were actually 10 tanks. They had been sent by Muammar Gaddafi on the French transport ship to go to Uganda to help prop up Idi Amin's regime, which was fighting a civil war at the time. And as they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, Amin fled Uganda, and they had no place to take their cargo, so they docked at Durban. And when the South Africans discovered what was on board, they seized the 10 tanks. They kept 2 of them and sent the other 8 of them to us via rail transport in June of 79. And what we didn't know was that we had had them for a couple of months already, but none of us knew that. And then we were selected as the new group of trainees to learn how to drive, shoot, load, and command the T-54-55s, which was all very, very, top secret stuff, but top secret to us. Probably everybody else knew about it, I'm sure. But so then we basically what they did was they took all of the regular force members from armored cars who still had a couple of years or more left on their contracts, and they wanted those guys to be trained on the tanks so that they wouldn't lose them in the next 6 or 8 months when they went back to civilian life as as national servicemen. So they pretty much made the new, it was called E Squadron, Rhodesian Armoured Corps. That was pretty much comprised of regular soldiers who at least had a couple of years service left to go. And they put our new training camp up at Nkomo Barracks next door to the Selous Scouts Regiment at Nkomo. Although, I mean, when I say next door, it's figuratively. We were not next door. We couldn't see them, and we never actually saw them or encountered them. But we were at Nkomo Barracks, and we created a tank park there where we did our training on the T-55 54s. Again, pretty much like with the Elands, learning how to drive them, how to maintain them, how to fire them, how to command them. And with the T-54, there's an additional position of loader. So you've got 4 people in the tank as opposed to 3 in the Eland. And we got stuck into doing the training on those tanks, which was very interesting actually. You know, here am I, a kid from Canada, learning how to operate a Russian T-54 55. I call them T-54/55s because they were originally Polish-made T-54s that had been modified with T-55 features, and they were traded with Libya in the mid-70s in an oil for arms deal with Poland. So Poland was getting oil from Libya in exchange for these thousands of T-54s that they had upgraded to T-55 tanks, and traded them with Libya for oil. Yeah.
Sure.
So we're stuck into doing this training at Nkomo, and about I'm going to say midway, we're probably 2 or 3 weeks into September of '79, and Daryl Winkler, he was a captain at the time, drove up to the tank park at Nkomo on a bright, sunny Rhodesian day, called us all together in the main marquee tent, and told us that we would be dropping our training on the T-55s, and we were going to embark upon a mission that he said we should be honored, and we should be privileged and honored to have been selected for. And of course, again, you know, as the proverbial troopy that knows nothing, we're scratching our heads trying to figure what have they got in store for us now. Well, what they had in store for us was Operation Miracle. So we put our T-55s away, loaded up into transport, went back to Salisbury, and drew our Eland 90s for Operation Miracle, which was the combined forces raid into Mozambique at the end of September 1979. And I always say it also included the beginning of October '79, because our particular vehicle was the last one to go into Mozambique, and it was the last one to come out. And by the time we came out, it was October. And many people had been out several days ahead of us. So, you know, their take on Op Miracle, well, it was September '79. And I'm like, well, for some it was, but not for everybody. So we drew our Elands, and one of the things I noticed about as we were preparing them, as we were bombing them up and getting them ready for battle, was that suddenly we were being offered ammunition as if there was a never-ending supply of ammunition, which had never happened before. Rhodesia was very, very stingy with the expenditure of arms and equipment, especially in the Armored Car Regiment. If you fired off a 90 mil round, you better be prepared to prove why you fired that 90 mil round off, because they couldn't afford to just, you know, send them down range without good reason. But this time we knew something was different because they were just heaping the ammo on us like, we've got no place to put this ammunition. You know, we're running out of room to store it all. And we knew something big was happening, but again, you know, secrecy was paramount and nobody knew what was going on. But then we were told to take our armored vehicles back up to Nkomo, which had us thinking, okay, well, we're going to use the tanks and the armored vehicles, or the armored cars. But when we got to Nkomo, we ended up at the Selous Scouts encampment. And there they almost overnight painted our elands in Frelimo green from the Rhodesian camo. And there we were married up with all the other Selous Scout elements that were to accompany it. Well, actually, we were accompanying them because it was Selous Scouts that led that raid into Chimoio, the final Chimoio, on Operation Miracle. And once we got there, of course, we couldn't come out of the camp. And that's when we knew where we were going. We were going into Mozambique, and we were going to attack Chimoio, the third Chimoio.
Yeah, yeah.
Which we did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, John, I can only say that from...
Sorry, that was I believe the Frelimo called the Battle of Mavondi. But that was where that famous hill, Monte Cassino, was, I believe.
Yes, Monte Cassino. Yeah.
And I believe that Frelimo had a few of the T-55 tanks themselves, 3 or 4 of them, somewhere around there.
They had the Frelimo had been supplied by Cuba, and Cuba had sent them T-54, T-55 tanks. They had T-34s in their inventory as well. And during that week-long battle at Monte Cassino, about halfway through the battle, I believe it was a Wednesday night, if I remember correctly, in the middle of the night, Frelimo sent a half a dozen of these tanks, plus a large group of armored infantry along with them, up the main road out of Chimoio to the camp access road, which would be about probably 60 kilometers north of Chimoio itself, I believe, the town of Chimoio, which is where the garrison was kept, the Frelimo garrison was. And I can always remember that night because we'd been 2 or 3 days literally without sleep. The battle had been going on night and day, night and day. There was no sleep, there was no rest. You caught cat naps when you could. And I remember that we were in the midst of the Chimoio complex, which was actually a bit surreal because when we were told we were going on a camp attack and having no experience before of being on camp attacks, we were thinking of buildings with bricks and mortar and stone structures and gates and fences, but Zanla had gotten smarter as time went on, and they had dispersed themselves over large distances in these camps, and they were literally mud and hut buildings, and very traditional looking buildings to some. I mean, I didn't know, first time for me to go into a major camp like this. And so it was all a bit, where's the tank parks? Where are they hiding all their equipment and all that stuff? Well, in the bush, basically. But anyhow, we had bedded down for the night. We were in a 360-degree defensive position. Guys were, half on, half off, sleeping. And I can always remember I was sort of part dozing off in the turret of my eland as the gunner. And I don't know whether I heard it because we had two radios in our elands. We had the 25-watt Big Means radio and we had the 5-watt intertroop radio. So we could hear all the big stuff going on the big radio, including the overhead command aircraft that was flying over top 24/7. And I don't know whether I heard it on the radio or whether I actually heard the sound of the tanks, but something kind of roused me out of my sleep. And everybody else that was outside of dug into the trenches and everything there heard it as well, but they heard the tanks making their way up the road northwards from Chimoio to the camp. And I for a moment there was a palpable panic that you could hear and feel from everybody there, because I don't think anybody in our group had ever experienced tanks before, other than training on them. The group of us that had been training on the T-55s, but I don't think anyone else in that bunch had heard tanks approaching them in the middle of the night, ready to take them on. So there was quite a bit of consternation amongst the ranks about what was happening. And I remember that Darrell Winkler came down to us, and he ordered three of us Elans to head off down the main camp road to intercept the tanks before they got in amongst us. So they could only come down the main camp access road. There's no way they could have gone cross country. And we set out in the middle of the night with no night vision equipment, no modern GPS equipment or any of that sort of thing. And we headed off in the dark with our lights off, blacked out, to intercept the tanks as they approached. And we got within about 200 meters of the main access road, the T-junction, I'll call it, where we had kind of a pretty much straight field of fire down the access road. The access road was basically straight at that point. And we pulled off one on either side of the road, and we laid our guns, the main guns, on the road where we anticipated the tanks would come towards us, and prepped our guns and made ready to fire with heat rounds and hopefully take out the Freddy tanks before they took us out. And I have to say that it was one of those times in my life where I felt that sickening feeling where, you're in a 6.5-ton tank and you're taking on a 30 or 4, I'm sorry, you're in a 6.5-ton thinly armored vehicle, and you're going up against a 30 to 40-ton tank with a pretty serious piece of firepower sticking out of its turret. So I wasn't feeling all that wonderful at that point, but anyhow, we laid our guns, and when I say we had no night vision equipment, the only thing we had that could be considered night vision was the reticles in the gun scope were illuminated, and they had a rheostat control on them where you could, make them brighter and darker. So that was our night vision, was we had a faintly illuminated reticle in our main gun scope that we could use to sight in on the tanks, but nothing to illuminate the tanks. Anyhow, thank goodness for the RLI, John, because it just so happened that an RLI stop group was positioned in the bush at the main access road at the T-junction, and they had direct comms with the Rhodesian artillery's 25-pounders, who were situated just inside the Mozambique border at a little place called Madison Square, named after the famous brand of cigarette. And they had pre-positioned fire tables, and one of the positions that they had pre-laid into their tables was the crossroads. And we had a magnificent grandstand seat of not only watching the flash of the artillery about 15 kilometers away, judging by the time it took the sound to get to us, but seeing them impact on the Frelimo tanks. And we're able to listen in on the Big Means radio and hear the conversation between the RLI stop group, who's adjusting fire for the Rhodesian artillery guys. And again, I say this, and I got to emphasize this: there's no night vision equipment. I mean, it was in its infancy. There were probably a few first generation night vision pieces of equipment in the Rhodesian Army stores, but that was it. And so the RLI stop group very expertly called in the first round of fire. I think it was a group of 3 rounds that came in first. And we could see the flash on the horizon, and these rounds were sailing right over top of us. We could hear them whistling over top of us, and then we could see the impact almost immediately as it happened, not more than 200 meters away from us. And within 6 rounds, they were on target.
Yeah, those 25-pounders were very accurate. Very accurate.
They were. And you know what? It was a magnificent example of combined arms in action in trying conditions. So when the first rounds landed amongst the Frelimo tanks, they did what I would call the mad 360 degree of fire, where they rotated their turrets round and fired off everything they had for several minutes. And so shredding the trees above us and whistling over top of us are all of their main gun rounds and their machine gun rounds, and just creating this most marvelous fireworks display you could ever imagine, but all sailing, other than hitting the odd tree over our heads, sailing over. I think actually what they were aiming at was Monte Cassino. They probably figured that's where the Rhodesian forces were, so they could probably see that feature against the night sky, and they were basically shooting at that, but missing us. We were right under their noses, basically. And then we heard a lot of screaming and yelling from that area. I'm sure it was the infantry troops they had with them, and they were probably directing the tanks to turn around, and they ended up turning around and heading southwards back the same way that they had come from. And thankfully, I breathed a bit of a sigh of relief then. Yeah. However, before we knew it, Darrell Winkler, who was there with his 2.5 Unimog mounting a 50 caliber Browning machine gun in the back of it, and his group of staff that were assigned to that vehicle with him, got the word from upstairs in the command Dakota that at first light we were to follow them and chase after them. So as soon as the sun started breaking over the horizon, off we went down to the main road and southwards, heading for Chimoio, chasing after the Frelimo tanks and infantry. And it was there where I actually saw the tank tread marks on the road. And that's when I realized that they were T-54 or T-55s, because there's quite a difference in the tread pattern and width between a T-34 and a T-54 55. And based on what we had already been training on, I guessed that we were going up against T-54s or 5s at the minimum. So I know my good friend and colleague Mike Reb Pierce wants to believe that he went into battle against World War II T-34s, but I didn't see a T-34 tread pattern there. But anyhow, I always let him believe that to be true. So, but yeah, we're rolling down the whatever the name of the highway is out of Chimoio southwards, and we've got the Lynx flying at telephone top level overhead of us, trying to spot them. And just as the sun was beginning to break over the horizon, we kind of came into a fairly large open area with sparse mapani trees, that sort of thing, fairly flat terrain. And the Lynx pilot said he thought that they had pulled into a grove of trees about 500 meters in front of us and had hidden under these trees. And the one thing I'll never forget this scene. I have to describe it to you. You know how the sun comes up in Africa on a beautiful clear morning, how bright and blue the sky is, and how that golden sunshine is peeking over the horizon. Darrell Winkler, his gunner, was Mike Pierce, who wrote a pretty good book called African Days, Hollywood Nights, about his experiences in the Rhodesian Army. Mike Pierce was Major Winkler's, well, he was captain at the time, Captain Winkler's gunner in the 2.5. And Captain Winkler said, Reb, they're in that bunch of trees 500 meters in front of us. So I can always remember Reb standing behind that 50 cal Browning, that classic Ma Deuce M2 Browning machine gun. And he starts opening up on that grove of trees where we thought the Frelimo tanks were. And Reb had his 50, he had put armor-piercing incendiary into his magazine, into his belts. I think it was 1 in 3 or 1 in 5 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, and he was hoping that he could brew up the external fuel tanks on the Frelimo tanks. So I always remember this. He begins opening up on them with the 50 Browning. And at that moment, a shaft of sunlight broke through the trees, and it was just like a spotlight on a stage. And it's illuminating Reb as he's standing behind the Browning, banging away, with the way the M2 goes, da 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 da. And you couldn't. It's forever etched in my memory. It was like something out of I don't know, a comic book, graphic novel, whatever you, just this amazing sight of Reb in the back of that uh, 2.5, banging away at the Freddy tanks. However, he shot the antenna off of the 2.5 while he was doing it. So the 2.5 had two antennas, tall whip antennas on either side of the roll bar. And if you traverse the machine gun the wrong way through them, you'd clip the antenna. Well, he shot one of the antennas off. So anyhow, but still, it was a magnificent sight. However, the Freddy tanks, in response, opened up on us and started shredding the trees and vegetation around us. So I was kind of like, gosh, damn, now they've got us, and we're going to have to go out and punch it out with them. And here comes that old sickening feeling again. However, just about that time, the whoever was orbiting in the Command Dakota called Winkler and said, "Break off the contact, turn around, you're going back." So while we were chasing the Frelimo tanks, what had happened was the raid basically had ended, and the withdrawal of the Rhodesian forces had begun out of Chimoio. And I remember reading in Scope magazine, they claimed 3,000 enemy killed in this massive killer raid, and I don't think I saw more than about maybe 50 dead enemy the whole time. We encountered them. We had an incident actually on the first day where Salute Scout Trooper Gerd O'Neill was killed beside our armored vehicle on the first day of the attack in a trench line skirmish. And we encountered the enemy in the trench lines. They had been well dug in. Actually, in this particular skirmish, there was a 12,7 Dushka and an old Portuguese MG-34 that was dug into the trench lines that were firing, obviously, at some point in time during the battle on us. And probably that's what had killed Gerd O'Neill in the initial battle. But anyhow, so now we get into the long pullback back into Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe Rhodesia as it was known then. And that took a good day or more to get out of Mozambique. And what happened in that day afterwards was the Mozambique army followed us out of Chimoio, and they had pulled up probably around the crossroads area, and they had unleashed everything in their disposal on the evening of the day that we pulled out. And wow, talk about a fireworks display. I don't know where they got all of that equipment and whatnot, but they literally, it was unbelievable how much firepower they unloaded onto Chimoio. I think, or I should say Monte Cassino. And again, they probably thought we were still there. And I believe there were some stay behind special forces guys like SAS or Salute Scouts that were still there. And they were going to call in airstrikes on anybody that came back to the camp. But yeah, that was quite a sight to see. They had ammunition to waste, indeed. Yeah, that was the end of Bop Miracle, and eventually we made our. They actually split the returning troops into two groups. One group went through somewhere closer to Umtali, and our group ended up having to go cross country on old logging roads, and we came back into Rhodesia south of Umtali. But in that same time frame, the Rhodesian Air Force had sent out air assets to attack the Frelimo convoy, and during those attacks, a Hunter jet was shot down with the loss of the pilot. I think it was Gordon. I think his last name was Gordon, if I remember correctly. And also a Canberra bomber was shot down as well by the same armored group. And when they must have shot them down using anti-aircraft weaponry, which is probably what we saw being unleashed on Casino the night prior. And there was a tremendous amount of it. So I'm not surprised that they were able to shoot down a couple of Rhodesian Air Force aircraft, and the crew on the Canberra was lost as well. And I don't believe they ever recovered any of the bodies. That came later when they did the many years later when a group of ex-Rhodesian servicemen went into Mozambique and found the crash sites of both the Hunter and the Canberra.
Sure. Yeah, I heard that story from somebody else. I can't remember who. May have been an SAS operator, Jungle Jordan, was within sight of that Hunter when it went down. He was terrified that the Hunter was going to attack them because it was coming sort of straight at them. But it was already, you know, it had already been killed, so to speak. But
Right.
yeah, what a story, eh? And so we've been going for quite a while now. So how did things end up for you?
Well, so after Operation Miracle, we took our limbs back and we turned them back in at Blackus and Houston Barracks and debombed them. You know, took lots of pictures, that kind of thing. Returning war heroes, all that sorts, you know, silly stuff. And then we went back to training on the T-55s. And then, of course, as we know, as events progressed later in the year, November and December, the Lancaster House Agreement was signed, and the ceasefire, on paper at least, came into effect. And then Lord Soames returned, and Zimbabwe Rhodesia became the colony of Southern Rhodesia again. And we had the elections in February and March of 1980. And I got to meet up again with, by then, Major Bob McKenzie. He'd been promoted from captain to major in preparation for Operation Quartz. And the T-55s were going to go with Bob McKenzie's squadron and attack a group of Zanla and Zipra hierarchy who were supposedly ensconced at the University of Rhodesia Audiovisual building. And our part in Operation Quartz was to attack that building in conjunction with Major McKenzie's squadron of SAS troopers and take out that building and those personnel. And as we know, that never came to pass. And what came to pass was the new regime of Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF for the next 40 years. Yeah. John, I just want to point out one more thing that happened during Op Miracle. I'll just go back. I'll cover it very quickly. In the first 2 days of the attack on Monte Cassino during Op Miracle, then Captain Winkler led his group of support troop infantry up Monte Cassino to attack the heights, which is where all of the anti-aircraft weaponry was dug into that bare rock hillside and very well covered. I mean, they endured 1,000-pound bombs being dropped, several that I witnessed, and they were still able to keep firing even after that. And multiple gun runs from the Hunter jets with their Aiden cannon, just pummeling that hillside. Anyhow, there was another smaller feature, more like a pimple, almost as high as Monte Cassino, just to the, I'm going to say the southwest of Monte Cassino. No, southwest. And it had it was honeycombed with, when I say anti-aircraft guns, I mean 37 millimeter, and I think even bigger stuff in there. And when Major Winkler's group went up the backside of Monte Cassino, that feature and all of the guns that were hidden there opened up on Winkler's group and had them pinned down for several hours on Monte Cassino, exposed on the bare rock face.
I believe
And
those features were the hills that you're describing are hills 761 and 774 or something, if my memory serves me
Yes, I
correctly.
think.
Yeah.
Yes.
They were almost as high as Monte.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and they were in a bad position. Jerry O'Brien, who was with a friend of mine who's since passed on, sadly, was up there, and one of the defenders on Casino rolled a Chicom grenade down onto him, and it landed like within arm's reach of him and fizzled out and didn't explode. Jerry laid down, and the thing was like within arm's reach of him, nearby his head, and fizzed out and didn't blow up. So, it was that kind of contact distance and whatnot that was going on there. And at the same time, Zanla is being aided by their well dug in anti aircraft weaponry. And I remember listening in on the Big Means radio to Daryl Winkler. And at the time, we were in the main encampment area of Chimoio, and the RLI support troop mortars were there. In those vehicles that they had with the mortars as part of the vehicle, and they were equipped with all of their bombs and everything. Mortar bombs were all in the storage racks in the vehicles. The mortars were on a turntable type of apparatus. They could fire 360 degree anywhere that they were parked. Really a nice piece of kit. And I think it was all Rhodesian made stuff, pretty much, other than the mortars themselves. And I can remember Daryl Winkler in what I think was a magnificent display of coolness and calmness under fire, firstly calling in the Hunter jets to pound the positions that were firing at them and correcting their fire and calling them in on multiple strikes. And then when they had to go back and rearm and rebomb, or rearm and refuel, then he called in those RLI mortars who were parked right beside us. And I remember that the mortar guys were putting full bag charges on those mortar bombs, and they were bellowing out of those tubes like a huge blast of flame, and traveling quite some distance to get up into the rocks of Monte Cassino. And again, Daryl was adjusting their fire calmly and coolly. And when they had to let those tubes cool down, then he was calling in the 25 pounders from Madison Square and walking them on top of the Zanla defenders. And actually, Harmon Cusack, the Rhodesian Army film cameraman, he was with us filming all this too. And some of that film is on the RLI video, that hour-long RLI video that Chris Cox put up, and it's on YouTube still. But that was pretty much Daryl Winkler calling those three separate elements in as each one expended its ability to fire, because the mortar tubes have to cool down, the gun tubes have to be cleaned, the hunters have to go back and get fueled and rearmed again. And this went on for a good number of hours. And I think, he wasn't given enough credit for this, but that's the reason Rhodesian Armored Car Support Troop Infantry was able to get back down off of that hill again, was Daryl guiding those assets onto the targets.
I have that video footage. I'll put some of it in this video just to illustrate your
It's great.
storyline.
Yeah. Oh my God, that is great stuff. I love watching the twin M3 50 cal Brownings the SLU Scouts had in some of their armored vehicles that were with us. They've got a firing rate of about 1,200 rounds a minute each. And I remember when they were lighting them off and they would stop firing, for several seconds afterwards, you would hear nothing but a metallic waterfall of empty cases hitting the metal floor of the armored vehicle after they stopped firing. It was an incredible sight to see. Yeah. Yeah. But getting back to independence in 1980, we were all given the golden handshake. If you wanted to get out of your contract, you could get out without having to pay a financial penalty, which you would have had to do under normal circumstances. So I decided that that's the route I was going to go, and put in my notice, letter of resignation, whatever you want to call it, and got out and headed off to South Africa, where I heard that everybody else that had left the Rhodesian Army was going to and was being employed again as a soldier in the South African Defence Force. So off I went on the blue train to Johannesburg, and from there to Pretoria to the recruiting headquarters, and was told to come back at the end of the weekend, and they'd take me on immediately. But when I went back to my hotel room, I made the mistake of phoning home and spoke to my parents, and they were very distraught. And I got a little homesick, and I decided to return home, which I did, and never came back again. Yeah. Other than in 2005 to Durban for the 40th anniversary of UDI celebration that they held there. So,
Gosh.
yeah.
Quite a
Yeah.
story. And thinking if you had stayed in the South African Army, you might well have ended up being a gunner in an Olifant battle tank and fighting the Cubans in Angola.
I'm pretty sure that's where they would have sent me off to. I'm no doubt they would have said, "Well, you're going to, an armored unit in the South African
Yeah.
Defense Force." Yeah, yeah, I'm
61
pretty certain that's
mechanized
where it would have
battalion or
been.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
She was.
yeah. So, and another thing, John, if I could mention, in my, I'm 68 years old now, and in my 68 years, this was probably the most influential time that I've ever experienced, was joining the Rhodesian Army and serving there. And when I think of the incredible soldiers that I served with, when you think of people like Bob McKenzie, and people like that, and other volunteers who came from other parts of the world. And yes, some of them were not so good. I understand that. There's always, a bad apple or two in the basket. But when I think of these were super soldiers, when I think about it in hindsight now, when you think of, my gosh, that army, that your country produced a formidable brand of soldier that most people in Canada could never understand unless they were there, and were part of it. Really, I'm like, even to this day, I'm still, I think of all those guys, and and a good number have passed away now. But it's amazing. It really is. Well, and if you think about units like the Selous Scouts, just a regiment who's that'll probably never be equaled again in the field of battle. I shouldn't say never, but boy, it's going to be a long time coming before there's another regiment that is like that wreaks such havoc amongst the enemy. My God, it's unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I
Dave,
have in the first week of October, just passed, I was flown down to Austin, Texas to appear on a podcast called the Stay Zero Podcast. And it's run by a company called Zero Foxtrot, and they are a men's apparel company. And they heard about I bought some products from them, some T-shirts and stuff like that. And they found out about my service. So they flew me down there for 3 days. And I appeared on the Stay Zero podcast. We did a 3-hour podcast. And it should be out December the 8th. It should be podcast number 29. And this podcast interviews soldiers, first responders, EMTs, whatever, firemen, and gets them to talk about their story. And unfortunately, in the 3 hours that we had, we just glossed over the surface of the story. Didn't have enough time. The time went by in a blink of an eye. So I'm not sure I've done a very good job with it, but it should be out December the 8th. They'll probably edit it down to 2 hours. And as well, my local newspaper here in Harrow they have a special Remembrance Day section that they put out each year, and they did a 2-page article on my service in the Rhodesian Army as well. So got a little bit of, yeah. So anyhow, I'll send you some pics of that one as well.
Great. So you were born in 1956?
56, yeah. My dad was a pilot in the Second World War. He spent 3 years in Great Britain. Basically, he was at number 3 Advanced Flying School in Uphaven. He was a pilot officer. And what they did there was, when the pilots who had just got their wings from the Commonwealth Air Training Program, which happened in Rhodesia, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. They would come over there with their brand new qualifications, and basically what my dad was involved in was converting them from flying a single engine and two engine aircraft to flying multi-engine aircraft like the Lancaster, the Stirlings, and Halifax, and those sorts of aircraft, and then teaching them how to fly them in combat. So that's
Yes.
what he did for 3 years. Yeah. He even married a British Major General's daughter, Major General Robert Pargeter, who was in charge of artillery and coastal defenses. And my two older half sisters, who are still alive, are from that marriage. His wife sadly died in the early 1950s, and then he remarried again, and that's from that marriage I sprang.
Yeah.
But yeah, he married a British Major General's daughter. Yeah, young whippersnapper Canadian pilot marrying the Major General's Pargeter's daughter. Although, as he tells the story, she married him.
Yeah, we have a lot in common. I was also born in 1956, so I'm also 68 years old now. And my dad was also a pilot trainer in World War II. I think he was with that Commonwealth.
Wow.
He used to train guys. I think they started them off on Harvards, and then later he was training guys on Spitfires and Hurricanes. But yeah, my dad was always a pilot. When I was young, we had a couple of light aircraft. You know, a lot of the farmers in Rhodesia had light aircraft, and but yeah, very interesting, Dave. Thanks so much, brother. Much
Wow.
appreciated.
John, it's an honor. It's an honor because I have watched so many of the fellows you've had on beforehand, and when I think of all those amazing soldiers that I spoke of a few moments ago, those are the guys that, you know. Oh my God, it's unbelievable when you listen to their stories.